Sue, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the enormous courage that you have displayed in your leadership on the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, taking a strong stand for the small business people, the shopkeepers, and the citizens of this region. I also want to wish all of you a Happy New Year. Let's just hope that we're not looking back on 2020 as the good old days. You know, when Supervisor Wagner said that the Sacramento Bee had taken to calling the organizers as the event names, it reminded me of something I've learned in all of my years in politics. When the other side has to call you names, it means two things. It means you're winning the argument, and it means that they know that you're winning the argument. So I want to thank you for inviting me to join you tonight for this Justice for George Floyd demonstration. Now, this is very important to note because according to multiple public health experts, that prevents this weekend's conference from becoming a super spreader event. And if we've learned anything in the last 10 months, we must listen to the experts and follow the science wherever it leads. So many of our woke public health officials have told us that according to the science, mostly peaceful social justice protests are so important to public health as to dwarf any dangers from COVID-19. Now, of course, your life's work, the ability to put food on your family's table and keep a roof over your family's heads are non-essential jobs that must be brutally eradicated by those who have essential jobs in order to protect you from using your own best judgment. But don't worry, we just wrote everybody a check for $600, made possible from your family's taxes, and we've also made a contribution of $700 million in your name to Afghanistan. You're very welcome. The science has also apparently discovered that COVID can tell time. Fortunately, Governor Newsom has protected all of us by declaring a 10 p.m. curfew to run home, lock our doors, and hide from the virus until morning. Unless we're demonstrating for leftist causes, of course, in which case we enjoy a natural moral immunity from the virus. We call it the woke effect. But in all seriousness, what does the science tell us about COVID-19? Well, it tells us that COVID-19 poses virtually no threat to children, but it can be quite severe among the elderly. So what did the experts do with this science? They closed the schools and forced infected patients into nursing homes. Science tells us that obesity and high blood pressure can worsen the effect of the disease. So what did the experts do with this science? They closed the gyms and kept the liquor stores open. Science tells us that outdoor transmissions of this disease are extremely rare, while more than 80% of transmissions occur in people's homes. So what did the experts do with this science? Well, they closed the playgrounds, beaches, and campgrounds and forced people to stay in their homes. That's why I'm completely baffled, as I'm sure all of you are, that after California ordered people to stay at home, where the rate of infection is the highest, we're now seeing the highest rate of infection since the pandemic began. Who could have seen that one coming? In fact, a growing number of studies based on actual data tell us that there's no statistically significant correlation between the lockdowns and the infection rates. At best, the lockdowns have been remarkably ineffective at reducing the spread, and yet, unless you look at computer modeling that begins with the premise that the lockdowns are effective. Last May, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo admitted that 84% of COVID-19 hospitalizations in New York were people either already sheltering at home or at nursing homes. Obviously, the lockdowns didn't protect them any more than California's recent round of lockdowns has protected us. So perhaps the time has come to entertain the possibility that we are indeed being governed by idiots. Well, what else does the science tell us? According to the CDC's best estimate, if you catch COVID and you're under 50 years of age, your chance of recovery is 99.98%. Even if you're over 70, you have a 94.6% chance of recovery. If you're under 20, the survival rate is 99.9997. For this age group, COVID is less of a threat than the average flu season. And according again to the CDC, 40% of those who get this disease don't even know they have it. That inspired a Rod Serling meme making the rounds that says, imagine, if you will, a virus so dangerous that you have to be tested to know if you have it. Now, this is not to discount the tragedy of the 376,000 Americans who have died while having COVID since this pandemic began. You know, my mother's 90 years old, and I worry very much about her succumbing to COVID, but I also worry very much about her succumbing to stroke, heart disease, cancer, or the flu, not to mention the toll that is taken by social isolation. The problem is we have fixated on one danger to the exclusion of all else. And to be clear, this is a very nasty bug and not something to be taken lightly, especially for the frail and the elderly. But it is not the bubonic plague. It is not even the Spanish flu. The lockdowns have not only failed to save lives, it's becoming increasingly clear, in fact, alarmingly clear, that these lockdowns are needlessly costing lives. That's particularly ironic since the first and most ancient principle of medicine is first, do no harm. It was reported a few weeks ago that in San Francisco, excess deaths from drug abuse now exceed COVID deaths. Now, that's not the total deaths from drug abuse. That's just the increase in drug abuse deaths since the lockdowns forced so many into lives of poverty and despair. Alzheimer's deaths are way up as the afflicted are cut off from any contact with friends and family and social stimulation. What happens when you destroy the social connections that people rely upon to maintain their mental health? When you destroy the connection that the elderly need with their families? When you cut off the spiritual uplift and hope that so many get from church? When you cut off children from an entire year of school and daily contact with their social peers? When you wantonly destroy the life's work of millions of shopkeepers and small business owners and demand that they stay at home as their incomes evaporate and their savings dwindle? Well, we already know the answer to these questions because we're measuring it in human lives. Suicides, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence and abuse, homicides, lethal delays in health treatments and health screenings, and poverty-related deaths as tens of millions of Americans are thrown into poverty. Globally, the United Nations warns that 130 million people will starve to death around the world because of the economic damage caused by these measures. You know, I asked Anthony Fauci way back in April if he'd had taken these factors into account in the draconian measures that he was introducing into this country. His answer was a breezy, well, no, we really don't. Bureaucratic translation, don't know, don't care. And that's the problem with blind reliance on experts. They don't look beyond their area of expertise. Lord Salisbury, a 19th century British prime minister, summed up his education in national leadership this way. He said, "No lesson seems to be so deeply inculcated by the experience of life as that you should never trust experts. If you believe the doctors, nothing is wholesome. If you believe the theologians, nothing is innocent. If you believe the soldiers, nothing is safe. They all require to have their strong wine diluted by a very large admixture of insipid common sense." Now, Churchill made a similar observation when he commented that you could take the ablest generals from the battlefield, place them in a war council in London, and at the end of the day, have nothing but the sum total of all of their worst fears. That's why a government by experts is so incredibly dangerous. That's why these decisions are supposed to be made by elected officials accountable to all of the people who we expect to take all of the factors into account, all the risks and costs of all of the available policy options, and then make balanced and reasonable judgments that are guaranteed not to satisfy any group of experts, but to assure the greatest good with the least harm. And it is precisely that expectation that has been dashed in this entire surrealistic world that we are now wandering through. Modern science and its many breakthroughs in immunology, epidemiology, and virology have given us advanced treatments and vaccines unparalleled in human history. But science is grotesquely incompetent to reorder human societies or to change the laws of human nature. Nor does it give officials the omniscience to know what's best for every person in every circumstance. Nor does it give them the right to deliberately destroy people's lives and livelihoods. You know, it's hard to remember that less than a year ago, we were enjoying the greatest economic expansion in our lifetimes. Poverty had dropped to its lowest level in 60 years. Unemployment was the lowest in 50 years. The income gap was narrowing. Wages showed their strongest growth in 40 years. You know, every American needs to see Angela Marsden's tearful video as she pours out her frustrations as a small restaurant owner in Los Angeles. Forced to drastically curtail her business during California's brutal shutdowns, she took out an $80,000 loan to meet all of the expensive requirements to move her dining outside and salvage what was left of her life's work. Instead, the authorities arbitrarily changed the rules and shut her down again, a death sentence for her 10-year-old restaurant. Yet the same authorities permitted a film production company to offer the very same outdoor dining right across the very same parking lot the day she had to close her business. When asked to explain these capricious standards, Governor Newsom smarmed, "Oh, I'm deeply empathetic." Well, that must be a load off their minds. You know, I'm reminded of Leo Tolstoy's depiction of the Tsar's government. He wrote, "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and all the while assure him and anyone who will listen that I'm willing to do anything I can to help, except by getting off his back." The fact is that the only genuine relief from the COVID lockdowns is to end the COVID lockdowns. Why is it? Thank you. Past 10 o'clock already? No, not quite. What a relief. I don't understand why is it so hard for policymakers to understand that simple point? The plight of Angela Marsden and the countless victims of these policies tell us clearly what we are effectively accomplishing. We're destroying our society. Nearly half of American retailers say they're now in imminent danger of permanently closing. Forbes magazine reports, quote, "The number one worry of small business owners' minds now is the threat of more government-mandated business closures." 11 million Americans who had jobs in February no longer have them today. And the poorest families are the ones who've been hit the hardest. We have arbitrarily and indiscriminately destroyed the life's work and life's dreams of millions of Americans like Angela Marsden. We've made the most sacred right of Americans to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into a hollow and bitter mockery. And tonight we exercise our First Amendment right to freedom of speech, our First Amendment right peaceably to assemble, our First Amendment right to petition our government for redress of grievances, and our Fifth Amendment right not to be deprived of liberty without due process of law. And yet there are many clamoring tonight to strip us of all of these rights and treat us as misbehaving children rather than as free citizens in a free nation exercising our own best judgment. When Newsom closed the churches in violation of the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of religious practice, he dismissed the churches as high risk, low reward. Well, actually, I'd argue that our churches offer one of the most essential services in our society in a crisis like this. They offer us hope. You know, for nearly a year, Sweden didn't force its businesses or churches to close. Sweden didn't shut down its schools and abandon its children to the streets. Sweden didn't even order a mask mandate. Swedish officials did what free societies do. They gave the best advice they could and trusted their citizens to use their own good judgment of what measures made sense to them. Well, as of today, Sweden's mortality rate for COVID is 202 per million below that of the United States. Sweden's rate, if you applied it to the United States, would translate to 66,000 fewer American COVID deaths. And meanwhile, Sweden has sustained a fraction of the economic damage inflicted on innocent Americans. Compare Utah with Colorado. They share a common border, common geography, common weather, same urban-rural mix, same general economy. Utah's restrictions have been very light. Colorado's have been brutal. Utah currently has half the COVID mortality rate of Colorado and 3/4 of the unemployment rate. But the greatest threat the new lockdown culture presents to our civil liberties is that it is fundamentally altering the relationship between Americans and their government. It's the age-old question that Cecil B. DeMille framed in his introduction to the Ten Commandments. Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God? Every time we step out our homes, the risks that we face multiply. A free society assumes that its citizens are competent to assess the risks, balance them against the avoidance costs, and to manage their decisions in a generally responsible way. It's called common sense, and it's a necessary prerequisite for self-government and liberty. When a risk presents itself, people naturally change their behavior. If they believe the risk of leaving their houses is too great, they're free to stay at home. If they believe venturing beyond their front doors is a manageable risk, they're free to venture into the world, taking those precautions that to them seem the most prudent. In an epidemic, their assessments of risk might convince them to avoid crowded theaters or restaurants, wash their hands more frequently, avoid handshakes, wear masks, or become hermits. These acts don't require force, and they don't make any demands of others. They are a matter of individual judgment and freedom of choice. In this pandemic, many elected officials have abandoned the practices of a free society. They've crossed some very bright lines that separate free Americans from those unfortunate to live under authoritarian regimes, and they've set a very dangerous precedent for the future. So where's all this taking us? How will historians look back on this bizarre period of world history? Now, the left believes that the aftermath of the coronavirus panic will produce a population highly dependent on government, inured to social control, subservient to self-appointed experts, and dedicated to woke culture. Well, they may be right. But more likely, I believe that as this panic subsides and as the full measure of the damage that it has caused is taken, America could see instead a rebirth of liberty, the fresh skepticism of the charlatans who seek to control every aspect of our lives, and fiscal constraints on government that will produce the most dramatic downsizing of bureaucracies in our history. Apocalyptic climate scenarios modeled by experts that have been used to advance the left's agenda for decades may finally come under new scrutiny now that the public has experienced the damage done by faulty coronavirus models. The designs for an all-encompassing welfare state may finally face the fulfillment of Margaret Thatcher's prophecy that sooner or later socialists run out of other people's money. State and local governments are already facing the necessity to make deep cuts as their revenues plummet. Leftist economics is based on the assumption that government finances our economy. As Americans can now plainly see, the real world works in precisely the opposite manner. The economy finances the government, And when the economy is shut down, so too is the revenue feeding the left's agenda. The violent riots that in part draw their energy, destructiveness, and intensity from the pent-up frustration and anger of an entire population in lockdown may awaken the great silent majority that has slumbered since the last era of radical violence, an awakening that produced a center-right realignment that began in 1968. Confronted with the devastation caused by these lockdowns, Americans may discover a new appreciation for the pro-growth policies of free market capitalism and a new disdain for the economic stagnation of command and control socialism. Which direction our country takes will be decided in the state and local elections in 2021 and 2022, as local and state officials responsible for these devastating policies face the voters whose lives they have completely upended. A nation like ours, with a proud heritage of freedom, has seen the best and worst of times in the span of just 12 months and may soon put that new experience to work. We began the last year with one of the greatest economic expansions in our history, lifting millions of Americans out of poverty, boosting wages for American workers, finally reducing the income gap, all set in motion by economic policies that included the largest regulatory rollback in history and one of the biggest tax cuts. After less than a year of leftist authoritarian policies, that prosperity lies in ruins. These policies have rapidly produced not only the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression, but the collapse of the rule of law across our country. The good news is that more and more Americans are questioning the lunacy of these policies and the hypocrisy of those who impose them. Newsom's curfew order was met with spontaneous, defiant demonstrations across the state. Elected sheriffs are increasingly refusing to enforce these orders. Pastors are reopening their churches. Businesses are reopening even as their owners are taken away in handcuffs. You know, all mass hysterias are driven by blind fear and fanned by politicians who see opportunity in that. We've learned that such fear can cause a free people to abandon their legacy of freedom and independence, their prosperity, and their common sense, but only for a while. Every time in history this has happened, there's always a moment when the fear fever breaks and the hysteria suddenly burns itself out. They all pass a tipping point when the absurdity of it all becomes so apparent that it overcomes the fear and the people turn on their tormentors. I don't know if the recent wave of business and religious persecutions, the unlimited home detention orders, and the demonstrated hypocrisy of those who order them signals that moment yet. But every shopkeeper who defies these petty tyrants, every parent who confronts their school officials, every person who refuses to comply with the dysfunctional, dystopian world created by the lockdown left, every person who is here at this conference this weekend brings us one step closer to that turning point, which is why your presence here this weekend is so important in hastening that moment, and it can't come soon enough. Thank you all very much for everything you're doing. God bless our great nation.